Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another session of shooting from the nib with FPAI. This is a series of sessions where we have for you some guests with whom we chat. It's usually a very informal, free-flowing kind of a chat. We ask them questions, you ask them questions, and they give the answers. As you can see with me on screen is the Nib Grinder, Jaspreet Gill. Also, his Instagram handle is the Nib Studio, and we have him here for a very specific reason. He's already been a guest on our show, and today we have another guest. Welcome, Jaspreet, and we have another guest who. Sorry, we have another guest who also is a nib grinder. Only he is a nib grinder of international repute. I would, before bringing him on, I want to just say a couple of things about him. His name is Mark Bacas, and you may have heard of him. And we are going to have him very shortly to talk with him. Interestingly, he and I seem to have one thing in common, which is that he also has kind of an IT background. I'm also an IT guy. He was an IT guy before he started into nib grinding. My point is I'm still an IT guy, whereas he's moved on to better things in life, right? So let's welcome Mark on screen. Good evening, Mark, or good morning for you. How are you doing today?
Very good, very well.
Okay, all safe, everyone fine in your area and your family, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, well. Good to hear that. Good to hear that. So, Mark, thanks for being on the show. Really appreciate you taking the time to sit with us and chat with us a little bit. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to your fellow nib grinder, Jaspreet, and let you two duel it out. We have some questions for you. So
Sure.
over to you, Jaspreet, and all yours.
Hi, Mark. First of all, thanks so much for being here. And I think you know that I'm a big fan of you, and your Instagram images, they really turn us on sometimes.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I hope everything is safe at your end. So also, we really like to see the writing samples of your nib grinds, and also we know you're a big fan of mango chutney. Yeah. So we'll start the session, and we'll start asking some of the questions which we have for you. Yeah. So first of all, can you tell us, before you got into nib grinding, what got you into the fountain pens in the first place?
Sure. I've always liked something about pens and the functionality of pens in general. When I was much younger, my father brought home a fountain pen. I think it was like a Parker 21 or a Parker 51. Maybe he had maybe a couple of them. I think I kind of borrowed them from him, took them, and was just played around with them. I'm not sure whatever happened to those. It was a long time ago, and I didn't know any more than just those few that he brought home. Later on, I studied architecture at college and in high school, and so I was interested in mechanical pencils and nice lettering and stuff like that, and but didn't do a whole lot with pens at that point. But later on, I had a technical job and moved to Atlanta as part of that. And here in Atlanta, there's actually a fountain pen group called the Southeastern Pen Collectors Club. So that was here, but I didn't. I eventually found out about a pen show that was happening here. This was a long time ago, and back then it's called the Atlanta Pen Show now, but back then it was called the Great Southeastern Pen Show, and it was actually in the newspaper, and so found out about that and went to that show. And that was pretty much it. After I went to that show, and found out that, there's a whole world of fountain pens and stuff like that. I got hooked. and
Yeah,
been going to that show ever since, and getting more involved.
yeah, I can understand. Going to a pen show is a whole different experience than just meeting few people in your city, because
Yeah.
you definitely get to see a lot of different manufacturers, different type of pens, inks, notebooks,
Yeah.
and usually lots of workshops also. So that's great. And how long ago you started? Was this pen show?
This that was probably over 20 years ago, maybe 20,
Oh,
so 25 years ago, maybe, or so.
oh,
My oldest son, so he was born in 91, and he would go around to pen shows with me when he was 4 or 5, and we would travel to a pen show in North Carolina, which isn't too far away.
oh, great, cool. So we'll move on to the next question.
Sure.
So what made you try nib grinding for the first time, and how was that nib? How did it turn out?
Yeah, so I collected pens and stuff like that for a long time, and as most other people probably also have in the hobby, at some point you have someone else do a grind for you.
Right.
And typically that you get other you may get someone else to do a grind for you. At least here in the U.S., there are
Right.
multiple grinders, and so I started down that path of having different nib grinders, do grinds for various pens that I had, and just as part of that, I would watch and see what they do, and got more interested in that process. I would kind of look at my own nibs as part of that gradual process as well. And so Mike Masiama,
Yeah.
super nib grinder, nib master. He was actually he used to live in the Atlanta area, and he was part of our pen club that I belonged to. He would come to some of the meetings and share his knowledge. And I used to watch him a lot, as well as the other grinders. And then, so I guess, I don't know if it was about maybe 5 years ago or so, maybe more, around there. I was watching him at the Atlanta Pen Show and talking to him, and he's like, yeah, you might want to try it. And so he just gave me a little bit of encouragement. So after that show, I tried to figure out a way I could do a setup. I wanted to emulate his process as much as possible, just because I like that process of the way he grinds nibs. Not that there's anything wrong with other processes, but so I bought some equipment and started. I bought some. I think I bought at the time some inexpensive noodlers nibs, ones with tipping material on them, and started. And I don't recall. I'm sure I did some sort of italic or stub or something like that. I'm not sure exactly how it turned out. It probably compared to today, it was probably not that great.
Yeah, I can understand. Even so, for me, similarly, I used to look at your Instagram pictures and then try to understand how to go about it. And I think many of us really want to try cursive italic for the first time.
Yeah, those
Yeah.
make sense. That type of a
Right.
grind, it makes sense. It's
Right.
the simplest, style of a grind. Some sort of italic or a stub. Those are pretty straightforward. And as long as the nib is in, good
Right.
shape and has tipping material on it, you have a pretty good chance
Definitely.
of doing it.
So, and next question is that, so when you started, did you ever think that you would be doing it professionally for other people, or?
I thought I was doing it kind of as a hobby, maybe on the side. Just doing it for friends, maybe. It's a tough question. I mean, I probably had aspirations of getting to the point where I could do it professionally and doing it, as a business, but I didn't know. I just wasn't sure. It's one of those things that I didn't know how good I would be, or if I could,
Right.
So
was it a slow progression, or?
Yeah, it was a slow progression. Yeah, it was definitely a slow progression. I would buy. When I first started out, I was buying Pilot Metropolitans,
right,
and I would do grinds on those, and then I would sell them, basically at cost, just to do something and get something out there. I eventually and still carry Twisby pens, just as inexpensive way for customers, someone to try a grind without sending me a pen.
right.
And their nibs, are Yowo based nibs, so they're typically, pretty good to work with.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it was definitely a gradual process, a progression of, just doing a little bit for friends and just trying to get the word out there at some point.
Right. Yeah. Somehow, I felt the same. Right. It takes a while to get into that charging people for the grinds, that zone. Yeah, I understand.
And also just time behind the grinder and doing the grinds and doing the process. The more you do it, the more you feel comfortable with doing it.
Right.
So,
yeah, practice makes us perfect. So I think it's a never-ending process. You continuously keep on learning about. Right.
I agree. Yeah.
So, who has been your inspiration?
I draw inspiration from all the different grinders and like to look at the nib work, that all of them do. I think probably some of the earlier grinds first grinds that I ever had done was by Richard Bender, and then of course Mike Masiama, Deb Kenny. There's been lots of grinders that I've had nib work done, and all of them were inspirational and fun to watch their processes and stuff like that. But probably Mike Masiama is probably one of the main people that I've watched and drew inspiration from.
Definitely, yeah. I'm assuming that since you started long ago going to the shows back in 2000, so probably we didn't even have Instagram at that time to see different. Yeah. I think that way I'm very lucky to have all the zoomed in pictures of the grind. So it's comparatively much easier to understand what each, and everyone has his or her own page. So that is also very, for us, maybe it's much easier to have inspiration now.
Yeah, I would think so. Because back then it was just seeing people at shows and maybe watching a video or something. I forget when YouTube started, but sharing videos and stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So you almost answered a next question, but still, yeah. So have you ever approached any nib maestro for advice? And if yes, how receptive and helpful they have been?
Yeah, I've talked with they've all been fairly receptive to sharing information, and of course at pen shows you can watch what they're doing. You can just sit there and watch, and a lot of them are very friendly. I think all of them are, very friendly, and they'll sit there and answer questions. Most nib grinders are processing and doing stuff in front of you. There are a few actually that it's hard to see what they're doing because of their process. But a lot of them, are doing whatever they're doing right in front of you. So, and most of them will be happy to answer questions. And like I mentioned, Mike would come to our pen club meetings, and he would share information just about fountain pens in general and capillary action and, ink flow issues and stuff like that. So even that stuff was good to know, even from a nib, a person who works on nibs. That type of information is good to know, just because, you're at some point you're not just doing grinds. You may have to figure out, what another issue is. Maybe the ink's, the pen's not flowing properly, and what's causing that. So, yeah.
Yeah. In that sense, I think the fountain pen community across the globe is very, very helpful, because similarly, like I have spoken to you many times, and even in India, like sometimes if I run into a problem or I want to know something, I contact Sudhir for the same reason. So I think that's a good thing about our community.
Yeah.
Right. So next question is very interesting, which even I ask myself sometimes. So can nib grinding earn one enough to pay the bills?
Yeah, it's a good question. Here, I guess it really depends on the bills, that someone has. If they're single and don't have a lot of bills, then maybe it's not as big of a deal. But yeah, I mean, someone doing nib work can definitely just depends on their volume, the amount of nibs that they do and process and things of that nature. But it's that was also part of the progression, like mentioned earlier. I was in IT, so I had a regular job, so I wasn't really dependent on the nib grinding income. But it got to the point where I was basically doing IT work during the day, and I would be up all night and all day on weekends doing nib work and processing orders. And my backlog was still growing. When I first started, I didn't think, it was like, I didn't even think I'd ever have a backlog. I'd get pens in and could work on them and ship them out. So yeah, again, that was just a progression. But it's at some point, it just gets to the point here in the U.S. Like I take PayPal as one of my main methods of, I send out an invoice for PayPal, and at some point, once you start processing so much volume, they will submit a form to the tax people here, indicating how much you've processed. So, it just, it gets to the point where, you just have to start keeping books. You have to, at some point I set up a business checking account. So there's a whole side of that as well. You have to take all of that into consideration, that whole setup and everything, the whole financial and business side of things. But yeah, I think a nib grinder can definitely make decent.
That's a good news for me also. So do you also get your hands dirty?
Oh, certainly. At home, it's not so bad because typically I get the pens that come in, I on my form on my website, I, kind of say, empty your pen out.
Right.
It's not imperative that they empty their pen out, but
Right.
if they don't, then some ink can get slung into the cap during shipment and stuff like that. So most customers empty the pens out, so they don't have any ink in them when I get them. And at home, I use Waterman Serenity Blue for the most part for testing, which comes out pretty easily. But at pen shows, my hands will look like yours. I'll and it'll get like embedded and sometimes my fingers will have like cracks in the tips of my fingers and stuff like that. For long pen shows.
Yeah, I can. Maybe I should also start changing my ink or start changing my method a little bit, because dirty hands, they just get too messy at times.
Yeah.
So next question is like, what are some of the most common grinds requested and most interesting or challenging grinds which you have done?
Yeah, I get the typical italic and cursive italic. I also do a cursive smooth italic, which is just a slightly more rounded version of a cursive italic. Those are most often most grinders. Another thing as far as that, most grinders will have some form of a smoother version of a cursive italic. So those are the common ones. That and architects are probably the quite often requested. The most, as far as most challenging or interesting, those a lot of times happen at pen shows, or even I get requests in as well, but typically they're reversible style grinds where a customer maybe wants to do an italic on one side and an architect on the reverse, or something like that. Like I have one customer that she comes to I've seen her a couple of different pen shows, and she writes at a pretty high angle, and she also writes tiny. And so she wants like a micro cursive italic and reverses to a micro architect. And so, that's complex, because just the minters, making things smaller and tinier and still having line variation and things like that. That's where it starts getting, pretty tough.
So does it take a little longer at the pen show to do such complex grinds, or?
Yeah, not necessarily. It takes about it doesn't take any longer than it would here for me to do here, but it's the main thing is at a show is there's interaction. So I do a grind and then from what she would describe to me is what she's looking for. And then I envision it in my mind and do the grind, and then give it to her and see if it's doing what she wants. And then maybe there's a little back and forth. Okay, I would like it a little smoother, going left to right or something like that. And so I'll look at it and process the nib. But yeah.
So yeah, exactly. This point is going to be our next question. How is the experience of grinding at a pen show different from grinding at home when people send it to you?
Sure. Yeah. So, at a show, it's great. There's, the person is sitting right in front of you, so you can watch how they write, what angle they hold their pen, if they tilt it or rotate it, all that type of stuff. So, you have that. They can explain to you, what they're looking for. You can do the work, hand it to them, let them try it. You can watch them. It's a lot of fun because you hand them a pen and a lot of times they'll go, ooh, or you'll hear them, they'll be excited, when they do something. So that part's a lot of fun.
Right.
And then the other thing is that's nice at a pen show is once you're done, you hand them the pen, you're done.
Right.
Whereas, so my process at home, I get a pen in, I have to catalog it, put it in my queue, then let the people know, hey, I've received your pen. So there's a whole process that I go through. And then one thing that I do is, as part of my process at home, is I actually do the nib work, and then I do a video of me writing with their pen after I do the nib work. I send the customer a link to that video. So that way they can at least kind of get an idea of how the nib is performing. I'll often tilt the page to see, the ink flows. That way they can see, if it's, some customers want like an 8, out of a flow out of, from 1 to 10. So they want to see ink, up, puddled on the page. And so I'll tilt the page and like I said, so that they can kind of get an idea for how it's writing. And, I do that also to, hopefully help, stop someone from sending anything back to me.
Right. So do you feel that in case of architect nib, if a person doesn't send a proper angle, a picture of how the person holds the pen, and because that's what I feel many times people, they send a picture, but it's not exactly the angle at which they naturally hold. And then when you send it back, it might not just be there exactly where they want it. Have you ever felt the same? Or
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible. I don't get a lot of, I don't know if it's just because the customers are nice, but I don't get a lot of customers that say, hey, it's not at the, particular angle. I've had a couple, maybe a few. On my forum, I ask, so that I invite people to send me a video or a picture of how they hold their pen. But one thing I have on my forum is I actually have them indicate what angle they hold their pen. And I reference it to like a clock. So like if they could imagine a clock is behind their hand, are they holding their pen at 1 o'clock, which would be a, average to high angle. Are they holding it at 2 o'clock, which would be kind of on a lower angle, or somewhere in between. And I look at that when I do the, specifically if I'm doing like an architect style grind, I check that, whatever they indicated on the form.
right. So now I'll invite Mihir for next set of questions. Hi, Mihir.
Hello. Hi, Jaspreet. That was wonderful listening to everything that you have just discussed. So, Mark, I've been always fascinated with nib grinding. And although I have never been able to do anything myself, the most I have been able to do is tune a few nibs using a nail file. But that's pretty much about my expertise or experience with nib grinding. Although I did once get a architect nib done from Sunny Co. and nib tuning done by Mike Masuyama. And people have told me that the nib done by Mr. Masuyama has been the best nib that they have ever tried, although it was tuned for my writing preference. So, but seeing those two work and then seeing Jaspreet work, or Sudhir does a bit of nib tuning and nib grinding, seeing all these people work, I wonder if it is just mechanical, or do you think there is some artistic bent to this?
Definitely an artistic bent to it. You have to kind of picture how you want things in your mind, how you want things to work. But there's definitely, it's an art form, at least to me. I feel that it's an art form. It's mechanical and as part of the process, but it's also an art form.
Sorry, Mark. I think we seem to have lost Mihir. He might be having some kind of a network issue.
Sure.
So I'm back. Let me jump on to the next question that was on Mihir's list,
Sure.
which was, what are the areas or the nib grinds do you find comparatively easy and comparatively difficult? I mean, there would be some which are probably easier to do than the others. You mentioned stubs and cursive italics. Which, according to you, would probably take the most effort and time?
Any of the reversible style grinds where a customer wants it to write, one way on the normal side, and then they want to be able to flip it over and maybe have it write finer. Any of those style types of grinds are often more involved, because not only do you have to consider the grind process itself, you also have to consider flow functionality and how that part of the process is working with regards to the nib. A lot of times when you flip a pen over, a nib over, the reverse side isn't necessarily doesn't have the same flow as on the standard writing side. So you have to maybe manipulate the nib to handle that.
All right, so Mark, I'm back. I got disconnected there for a bit.
Yeah.
I hope that didn't throw you off. But anyway, this kind of answers my question, because I was kind of thinking that it's definitely an art form and you look at it that way. But just like artists say, would there be something in that art form that you find particularly challenging? And what you have said definitely addresses that. Moving on from that, I've seen that different people use different tools to
So I think, Mark, we still have some issues with Mihir's connectivity. But there's the question that he was asking you, which is, what is the setup that you use for your grinds? Do you use any special tools, or are these readily available? Do they have to be customized, created for nib grinders specifically? How does that work?
Yeah, so different nib grinders use different processes, different tools. A lot of nib grinders use a Dremel tool, and when I first started, I used a Dremel. I used it in a little different fashion than most nib grinders here in the U.S. Use a Dremel. Most nib grinders in the U.S., they kind of have a Dremel sitting on a bench in front of them. Typically, they have a spinning disc
Right.
that's on the Dremel, and then they're typically looking across that disc, and they're applying pressure on the nib. They also typically leave the nib in the pen when they're working on it. So they're just holding the pen and kind of applying pressure. Mike Masiama and the people at Sailor Nagahara, they have a kind of a bar that sits in front of them that has cylinders on it that spin, and they typically, I believe the Sailor grinders as well as Masiama, they typically pull the nib out of the pen so that they can inspect the nib and inspect the function of the pen, and then they typically are grinding just the nib by holding the nib in their hand. And so I wanted to emulate that. So I had a Dremel, and I got this thing called a workbench press or something like that. I forget exactly what it was called, but it allowed me to turn the Dremel sideways. And then I got various grinding bits that were cylinder shaped, and set those up in the thermal, and that was how I first started. Later on, Franklin Christoph, a gentleman there, he's since passed away. His name was Jim Rouse. He introduced me to the Fordham bench lathe, which is that white looking thing here. It's a lower RPM based system. It's much quieter. It's like a large magnet type motor. And so I use that, but it's still basically the same process, and similar to like what Masiama would use, or Sailor, with regards to it being a cylinder, type thing, and I pull the nib out of pins to work on. So that's my main thing, and this is readily available. It's not a lot of the stuff that is used by jewelers can be used in the nib grinding world. Jewelers have a process of forming metal, grinding metal, shaping, metal, things of that nature. So that's the main place where I and Jim, show me various jewelry type shops that I can order stuff from.
Okay.
The main thing I use is there's a metal band, a diamond encoded band that I use to grind, and then I have a couple of other tools that are that I made myself, mainly to manipulate the nibs. There are a couple of pieces of steel, so they have these things that are used to measure the gap for spark plugs, and so I've taken some of those and modified them for my use.
I see. Okay, great. So now, since we are around the halfway mark here, would you like to show us the video, or let's go into how your setup actually looks and how you work on it?
Sure. Let me switch here. I think I'll mute this and turn my
So, guys, we are just going to wait till Mark turns on his other setup through his phone and show us his setup through the phone camera.
Okay, and this is probably a good time to just request everyone to subscribe to our channel. It really helps us. Please also hit the like button and the bell icon, which will give you a reminder whenever we plan something next and when it's coming up. So please do that and help support us, encourage us. It means a lot to us. And also, please put your comments in the YouTube comments box. I'm not sure Mark has a time limit, but we'll try and take questions as and when they come. I think Mark is
All right,
ready.
So Mark, whenever you're ready, you can show us.
Yeah, I'm ready. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. So this is the band that I was talking about as far as what I use. This is it has like a bunch of little disc, little dots, and each one of those dots has it's like diamond impregnated. So it's pretty aggressive as far as removing material. The other thing that I use a lot is my Bellamote Loop. These are probably one of my favorite kinds of loops. So I use a 15x loop for magnification. Here at home, when I'm grinding, I have this magnification light that helps a little bit, as well as I also have kind of a head piece that I wear for magnification. So like I mentioned, and feel free to stop me if y'all have any questions along the way. But like I mentioned, I typically pull the nib whenever I'm going to work on it. I stock Yowo nibs, so I have these number 6 nibs in stock. So I'll go ahead and just pull this nib out of this nib unit. Any particular so I'll just do an architect. I'll show you the process I do. There's a couple of different ways that an architect nib can be done. You could just grind the basically just the tip part, and when you do that, you'll typically end up with kind of a large shape pie wedge. I typically do architect slightly different, I actually grind the whole nib basically from the sides down. What that does is that ends up providing a much narrower shaped wedge at the tip. And in my opinion, you typically get better line variation with that. But yeah, so anyway, this is my setup here. It's a variable speed. So right now I usually, when I have a foot pedal that I'm actually depressing to turn it on and off. You can see here, I didn't turn the knob to turn it off. They make a foot pedal that you can use with this. So I'm pressing on the foot pedal, and then I spin this knob to where around the speed I'd like it to be at, which is right here. It's typically around the speed I use this. I might need to adjust the camera a little more so I can do this. So now, for an architect, I typically, before I begin, I'll inspect the nib, and that's just using my loop to check to make sure the tines are aligned properly, and that there's no issues with regards to the tipping, things of that nature. Once I've checked that and everything looks good, at that point I'll begin the process. For an architect, I basically just start grinding the sides away. The benefit to using, and you can see here, I can put my finger on this. It's not so abrasive that it hurts me. So that's another, nice thing as far as the process and everything. I can actually put my finger underneath here if I want to stabilize this. But typically I'll make a certain number of passes on each side. And I'll kind of look at it. I typically will check it and kind of see and make sure that it's uniform as I go. I want to make sure that I'm not grinding one side more than the other. The other thing, when you do an architect as well, you want to make sure the grind is parallel to the nib. You don't want to be off this way or this way.
Mark, could you also tell us why it has to be parallel and not the any
Sure.
other way?
Yeah, because if you have it a little off skewed, then the tip won't meet and match. It won't come together properly. You may have one side that's sticking out further, and it just won't be uniform, and that's important for the architect. So it really depends. So at this point, I'm getting pretty close to where I want it. It depends on how smooth. So on my form, I can do either kind of a crisp architect or a smoother architect. I can vary it. The It's gotten to the point where even my crisp architect. So when I first got started, when I was first doing architects and what have you, the crisper architects sometimes would have more feedback, a lot more feedback than the smooth ones. And so I mentioned that on the forum, but nowadays, even the crisper architects that I do, typically they're fairly smooth. Um, but I can make them smoother or crisper. If the customer says, "Hey, the main thing I want is maximum line variation," then I'll make that a crisper type of architect. And when I do that, I make the tipping thinner at the point. If they say, "Well, I really want it to be as smooth as possible," then I may leave that a little broader at the tip. But so now I've basically ground the nib. Can't really see it real good there, but I basically ground it pretty thin this way. So at this point, would begin the process of cutting the actual architect part of the grind. So I might just do a few more passes like this. Another thing that I've started doing a little bit on architects is I'll often, it's more of an aesthetics and but I'll actually bevel the top edge of this. So I'll rotate the nib slightly and kind of just run a couple of times and bevel that top edge. That's just for, like I said, just to make it kind of look nice. So at this point, I'll cut the architect, and here's where I'll look and see what the customer wanted as far as the angle. And so I'll do, if they wanted a high writing angle or an average or a low, I'll adjust the way that this is cut. So for now, I'll just do kind of a standard angle. And so I'll typically do one side of the nib, and then I'll switch the nib over, and then I'll do the other side to try to do it at the same angle. And then I'll check it with my loop. And the main thing you're looking for when you're looking at an architect is you really want to look across the tipping to see if one side is maybe sticking up a little further, or if there's any unevenness. And if one side is maybe up a little higher than the other, then I'll maybe make another quick pass, and then I'll check it. And so it looks pretty good at this point. I also do hybrid of the Architect, where I'll convert the bottom, the base of the grind into a blade shape. It kind of reduces the Architect by one size. So like if this is a broad Architect, it would make it into like a medium Architect. But if they don't hold it at a specific angle, the nib will still function, but it'll function kind of like a fine naginata type nib. So once I've done that and everything checks out here, I switch over to this other side. So basically, the grinder has two sides. So I can show you this now. Can y'all still hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you and see you properly.
Okay, good. So once I've done the grind and everything on this side, I then switch over to this side, and I have a kind of a piece of rubber type material. It actually starts out like this, and then I run through use and work. It ends up developing these kind of grooves. And so what I'll do over here is I'll actually run the Architect to help clean it up. Is I'll run this kind of the sides of it to smoothen out the grind. I'll run the nib through these grooves. And then on the other parts of the material, I'll run the Architect over it. And I may run the Architect down through the groove as well. All right, so that's that. That usually it doesn't. That part of the process doesn't take very long. And then after I do that, so I do all of that standing up. Once I've done that process, I then switch over to my finishing station. And here I kind of finish the process of checking the nib and cleaning it. A couple of the tools that I mentioned that I use. Typically, I'll use this to bring, if the nib is bent or the tipping is flared out, I'll use this to bring the tipping together. Maybe one tine is going one way, and I need to bring them one tine closer to the other. I'll use this to to adjust where the tipping comes together. If I ever want to increase flow, this is actually ground thinner, so this side is really thin compared to this side, so it's kind of like a wedge that gets thinner here. And I'll use this sometimes to increase flow or adjust flow, and I'll take the thinner side and push that up the nib slit, so it kind of expands this part, but doesn't cause any extra stress here. Also manipulate nibs with my fingers as well. If I want to increase flow, I may adjust that this way. And then Of course, I'll inspect the nib, check it. I have different pads that I use with micro mesh. So these are the main three that I use. This is aluminum oxide 12,000 micro mesh. These are all 12,000. This is the gray micro mesh 12,000. This pad is a little firmer than this pad. So this pad's a little cushiony. This pad's a little firmer than this one. And it just depends on what I'm trying to do. I may use a different one for a different process. I also have a brass shim that I use to clean out. So if I, so at this point, I may put the nib back into the nib unit. I have a tester stick here that Sean Newton made for me that allows me to screw in a Yoho on this side and a Bach on this side. And I have other ones for number 8 and number 5, Pelican nibs and stuff like that. So that makes it easy in case a customer wants to just send me a nib unit or something. So here I'll install the nib back in. Main thing I want to check for at this point is that the feed and the nib slit are in alignment. I want to make sure that this is centered to the nib slit. And then I would, after reinstalling, I'll typically check the tipping, make sure it's even, uniform, the tines are aligned, things of that nature. I use, for most of my testing and everything, customers can send me their own ink if they want an ink sample, and sometimes they will. But here I use Serenity Blue to test with. It's just a nice, straightforward ink that cleans pretty easily and just seems to perform pretty well. It's from a nib grinding perspective. This is probably, it's pretty important. You'll find most nib grinders have a particular ink that they use. The reason being is that ink can the how lubricated an ink might be. It'll make it feel a certain way. So it's important. If I was a nib grinder starting out, I would find an ink that you like and probably stick to it. Because if you're always using different inks, then it's like, well, is it the ink that's making it feel a certain way, or is it something with the nib? And so it just adds an additional variable to things, But anyway, so at this point, I dip it and I may test it, but typically I'll do some form of smoothing. So here you can see it's got it's actually pretty smooth. The rubber compound that I use to smooth the tipping on will sometimes smooth it out pretty well. But you can see how this has pretty good line variation here. Another part of the process I'll typically do for like an architect is, even if the customer doesn't want it, but if a lot of times if they ask or if they want it, I'll even smooth the reverse in case they want to use the reverse side for like a fine, extra fine. Also, when I mentioned about beveling the edges, that can help with that as well. That part of the nib, when I bevel the edges, that helps with the top part. The other thing I do use is a hard Arkansas stone. So like this is the finest Arkansas stone that they make. And so I'll use this a lot of times to maybe clean up edges of the tipping, things of that nature. Any questions? Any other?
Not right now. Maybe later when we do the live Q&A, time permitting.
Yeah.
But this was definitely wonderful seeing you work on the nib and get the final architect grind.
Sure. Sometimes what I'll do is on these pads is I'll take them and maybe pass the architect. If I want to make it smoother, I may kind of swipe it to the sides. I may do some figures like this. And then I always wipe the excess ink off. And then here I'll take, depending on what pad I use, you can see here, this pad, it has like these white spots. That's where the actual gray material often will catch in the tipping. And at that point, I'll use a brass shim to kind of clean between the tines, remove any of that debris. All right. Any other questions about my work area or workbench or?
So I guess we'll take up if the audience has any questions, we'll take them up during the live Q&A.
Okay. I'll switch back to my computer now.
Sure.
All right.
So guys, for all those watching, I hope that was interesting for you. All right. Welcome back, Mark.
Let me turn off the.
Right. So that was really cool to see the actual nib grinding happening in front of us. I'm sure that if somebody has never seen that happen, it would be a first time for them, and they would probably learn a lot from that. Now, having said that, what is the kind of advice or pointers you'd like to give people who are thinking of getting in a custom nib grind? Any pointers on how they should and why they should pick a particular nib grind?
Yeah. Basically, you kind of want to. I think you want to look at the style of writing that you're comfortable with. If you're a person that writes in block letters, an architect grind will often make block lettering look really nice. So that would be a grind that someone might want to consider. If you're proficient at cursive writing and your cursive writing looks pretty good in general, often a cursive italic will help with that. The cursive italic or some form of that will often help give you some line variation. So those would probably be the two main things I would suggest. And as far as pointers, even a person who does block lettering could try a cursive italic or a stub. Cursive italic is probably the better of the two. I do one thing that, and most nib grinders could probably, as long as you ask them, some cursive italics can be on the crisper side, so they could feel a little scratchy to some users. But if you ask the nib grinder, is there a way, I like a cursive italic, but I want it to be a little smoother. So I do both a cursive smooth italic, which is a slightly more forgiving cursive italic, but I can also vary the level of crispness of a cursive italic. So, if someone wants nice line variation, but they want it to be smooth, then I can do a cursive italic that would along those lines. but the architect is fun as well. You know, it's kind of fun and different. So, yeah.
I think what happens is because of the variation of line that one gets with the architect grind, that is the most fascinating. At least that's what I hear from people. Most people want to get an architect grind.
Yeah. I probably wouldn't recommend it as a first grind. You know, unless you're set and you write in that fashion, and it probably benefits most from being able to work with a nib grinder in person, because then they can really see the angle that a person, right? Because it's so angle specific. Although some people, I think, can adjust their angle a little bit, you know, to accommodate the angle that the architect's ground at. Like I can adjust my angles. Like if I look at an architect and I see that it's, you know, maybe a higher angle, I can adjust my angle. Some people may not be. That may be tougher for some people.
Yep. So, but then I guess the availability of a nibmeister in person would be a challenge. So
Yeah.
I guess people just take their chances with whatever they get.
Yeah.
But then, so taking this advice part of the question ahead, what advice would you give to somebody who wanted to start nib grinding?
Yeah, I would say, you know, start doing research and seeing the different processes. You know, there's different styles, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. You know, there's ones where you can use a Dremel and a disc, and that process where you leave the nib in the pen. Typically, you know, there's stones. You know, people that grind just using stones. The other thing to consider, I think, is so there's the learning process on what you need to do as far as shaping the nib. At some point, though, the other thing you have to take in consideration if you become more, you know, if you become more well known and you're having to do and you're doing more work, what then becomes an important part of the process is speed. You know, how quickly can you do a grind? How quickly can you remove the material off the tipping, yet still maintain the nib? You know, you don't want it to be so aggressive that it just, you know, takes a whole bunch of the material off, and then you have to go back and maybe change the process to finish it and clean it up. So that's kind of where I've gotten to the point. I used to use different bands. I used to use these micro finishing bands that would you know, produce this very fine surface grind, but it took a lot longer, and the bands didn't last very long. So, but yeah, I would say just investigate. You know, if there is a nib grinder that or you know, that you like, or that you watch, or that watch their process, and you want to try to emulate that, you know, maybe see if they're willing to discuss with you, you know, the process, or advise you or help you. You know, when I was first getting started, you know, I didn't have anyone that officially trained me, but you know, I watched, like I mentioned, Mike Masiama do his nib work, and he offered at least to, you know, if I had questions, I could reach out to him and ask him. So that was really helpful when I was first getting started, you know, that ability. So.
Thank you for giving that kind of advice. I'm sure if anybody is looking at taking up nib grinding, I'm sure that would help. So that brings me to the questions that I had set out for myself. I will now invite Kshitij over onto the screen to take ahead the session. Kshitij, welcome.
Thanks, Mir. Hi, Mark. It was really interesting seeing you work on the nib, and it was really interesting for us to get a up close look at your setup. So, looking at you grinding the nib and working on it, I feel that it's in pretty good hands, and there's very little that could possibly go wrong, especially since you were also, touching the grinding wheel itself. So, obviously, it's not taking material off at a very high speed. But still, do you feel any kind of pressure while working on more expensive pens? Or is it just like working on any other pen?
No, I mean, I do feel a little bit of maybe I may be, I'm probably a little more careful when I'm working on a higher end nib, a gold nib, palladium nib, a nib that, that's unusual. I may do different things to protect that nib a little more,
Okay.
during the process. Not an extreme amount, of difference. But yeah, the main things you have to be concerned about on some nibs. It depends from nib manufacturer to nib manufacturer, but things like the plating on the top of the nib.
Okay.
That's probably where, like, I have not on any super expensive pens, but I have accidentally, maybe nicked a part of the plating that was on the top of the nib, close to the tipping.
Right.
So what I'll do a lot of times is I have masking tape, some like painter's tape, and I may put some of that over the nib and only show the tipping part that I'm working on to help protect the plating of the nib.
Surface of them. Yeah. So, do you feel that there is any tangible difference working on, say, gold nibs versus steel nibs? I mean, in terms of the effort that they take to get the grind right.
Yeah, for the most part, those are fairly similar. There's not a whole lot of difference between a gold and the steel nibs. The main place where it starts getting a little different is the flexibility. When a nib is has some spring to it, that's where it becomes a little more tricky. Titanium nibs have a little bounce to them, and so those can be a little tricky to grind, or flexible. Like a King of Pen or an M1000, a Pelican M1000. Those nibs are really large and often have bounce to them. So,
Right.
So when you're grinding on those, if the nib was not, perhaps maybe it wasn't cut perfectly or something like that, or the shape of the nib, what can happen is one of the tines may lift up. They may not have the same amount of pressure going down on them. And so one tine will be up a little higher. So then you end up with an uneven grind. So that's the trickiest part to me, of doing the grind is really more on the flexibility or a nib that's bouncy.
So, Mark, what is your take on Indian fountain pens? Do you think they have a place or a segment of their own in the global market?
Yeah, I have a few ebonite pens, and I've worked on quite a few, I think, Ranga pens,
Yeah.
and they're very nice. I like them. I have quite a few of the various ebonite pens I got from Peyton Street Pens. I think maybe they might use some of the source their stuff.
I think they have Ranga pens that they sell via their website.
Yeah. And then I believe, I'm not real familiar with it, but I believe there's a company called Canwrite, Kanwrite.
Yes. Yeah.
I'd be interested to see more of their nibs. I think they do some of the flexible steel nibs.
Yes. They offer a variety of nibs and tippings.
Yeah.
And they do offer flexible nibs too. Yes.
I'd like to see, I think they have a place, the market in Indian market in general. I'd like to see more here in the U.S., more nibs, more pens, things of that nature. Yeah.
So I'm sure you get a lot of fountain pens that pass through your hands. What are some of your favorite fountain pens?
That's a tough question. I work on. I typically don't hardly use my own pens very much. I have a lot of pens, but I'm usually grinding and working on my customers' pens. But I like basically pretty much all sorts of pens. There's some manufacturers here in the U.S. Franklin Christoph. I've known Scott Franklin for over 20 years, I think, and I used to do like ad work for him. I used to be into photography, and so I would take pictures of his pens, and that would go into like Pen World magazine. And so I have a bunch of his pens, or Franklin Christoph pens. There's a custom pen maker here in the U.S. Named Mike Allen. I enjoy his. He's kind of makes this one model of pen, which is nice, and so I enjoy his pens. And I've collaborated with him a few times on having him make me specific material or a batch of pens. One pen that I like as far as a nib and the way the nib feels, well as far as the smoothness, is ST DuPont. They're pretty expensive pens, but there's something about it. I don't know if it's the weight of the pen, but typically their nibs feel really smooth. Again, I don't know if it's the pen or the weight of the pen. I've also Twisby is a nice company to work with, and I resell their pens. I've also started bringing in. There's a company in the Philippines called Kasama. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but I started bringing their pens into the U.S. I would get a batch of them. I believe it was mainly a doctor there. He kind of designed these pens, and he makes them. They make them out of these different materials, and so this is the kind of the packaging they use. And then they, like I said, they use different types of materials. One of the materials they use is called Ultim. So it's like this industrial plastic resin type material that's really strong and stuff like that. And one of the main things is that intrigued me about their pens was the grip section. It's kind of different. It has this quite a pronounced curvature to where the grip section is. So I enjoyed. I like these. Typically, as soon as I get them, they're gone though. So I did have one myself. I ended up selling it to Brad Dowdy, the Pen Addict. Yeah, I'm constantly working with them to get more in.
So I hadn't heard about Kasama up until now, and they seem pretty interesting. I'm going to check them out myself after we are done now.
Yeah,
it's different. Yeah, you were saying?
No, I was just saying they're different. It's an interesting pen. Yeah.
Right. So you did tell us about what you were doing before you got into nib grinding. I think you briefly touched on it while you were with Speak. Can you tell us about it a bit more in detail? Was the shift gradual, or did you just decide to switch over from your previous? Yeah.
Yeah. So when I was growing up, my dad was a chemical engineer, and he would bring home computers and handheld computers and stuff like that. So I was always, from a very young age, I was interested in technology as well. I ran a bulletin board system before the internet, things of that nature. And so I enjoyed technology and went to work for a software company.
Okay.
And that was in Louisiana. I grew up in Louisiana. And that company decided to move to the Atlanta area. And I moved along with them from Louisiana. And so I worked in the technology fields, software, tech support, customer service, documentation. I used to be a tech writer. And so I worked for this company. And then I ended up working for a larger company and managed their RMA portal. Company makes handheld computers and scanners and forklift computers. And, if a customer needed to get it repaired, they would go to this portal, put in their serial number, and it would tell them if it was under warranty or contract. It talked to an enterprise SAP system. It was developed in Salesforce. So yeah, I was doing that type of stuff during the day, and I was growing my the nib work. I was doing that, growing it, doing it on the weekends, and doing it at night, and it just kept growing and growing to the point where I basically needed to kind of decide, am I going to keep, because I couldn't do. It was going to be tough trying to do both, just continue doing both, because I would be up till like 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 a.m. working on nibs and so yeah, it was just a gradual process. And this year I switched over to doing the nib work full time. I was going to do more shows, more pin shows, and I did, several shows beginning. I did there's a show in Philadelphia. I did that in Maryland and Arkansas. So I was going to start doing more shows, and then COVID, coronavirus happens, kind of messed things up. But it's interesting because I'm still getting busier and busier. I think people are at home playing with their pens.
And wanting to try different kinds.
Yeah.
So Mark, do you do all of this alone, or do you have anybody helping you? And do you plan to have any interns, or do you plan to train more people?
Yeah, so I have an assistant that actually started, I guess it was probably the beginning of this year as well, when I started working on this full time. And she helps answer. She was actually a customer. She was in our pin club, and she was actually a customer. She likes the architect grind. And so she helps monitor my email. She'll answer questions. She knows a lot about pens and inks, and she knows more about ink than I do. She's got like a whole, shelf of inks and everything.
Right.
And so she knows a lot about nibs and my process. So she does that, and then she also helped keep my work queue in order, because I have different levels of my process. Like customers can pay a little extra if they want to express service. So if they want it to get be done quicker, they can pay a little more. And so she manages that whole process, as well as sending out invoices. I had 2 sons. One of them's older, and he's in on the West Coast in in Seattle area. And I have
Okay.
a younger son. He's 18 now. He's actually joined the military, so he's not here. But I was kind of teaching him a little bit, but he liked to play on his computer games and stuff like that, I think, more than any interest in the nib grinding aspect. But he would help move. When I get packages in, I put them in bins and keep them on shelves to kind of keep them in order. And he would help rotate and make sure that my bins were in order. So at some point, I would like to maybe teach a class. My assistant, I may end up, teaching her, some aspects, and see where that goes. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to maybe teach a class at some point. Yeah.
I'm sure there are a lot of people looking forward to that. So that was it from me, Mark. I would like to invite Sudhir to join us now, and he'll take it forward.
Hey, thank you so much, Hitesh. So, Mark, I'm back again, and we are right at the fag end. Just the next couple of questions now. I think most of the questions that are coming from the audience also have been answered. So let me jump in with this question, which is the business of nib grinding straightforward? Like you grind nibs and you make money, or is there something more to it?
Yeah, so it's quite involved. It would be nice. So that's kind of the process at a pin show. It's pretty straightforward. You do nib work, and you if the customer likes it, they give you money, you hand them the pin back, and you're done.
Yeah.
But as far as the business side of things, it's quite involved. You have the whole financial side of things at some point. If you're doing this more than just a few friends here and there, and just as a little hobby, that's one thing. But once it's kind of like a full-time business, then you have the whole, the incorporate, form it here in the U.S. We form an LLC. Then you have to start keeping books, your finances, accounting, reporting to the tax bureaus, internal IRS here, in your local tax facility, and so yeah, it gets to be quite involved as far as that goes. Not to mention the whole communications aspect with the customer, letting them know that you've received their package, they shipped in, then doing the work. Like I mentioned, I do a video of me writing with their pen, so I send them that, sending out an invoice. Then I have to clean their pen, rinse it, clean it, box it back up, make sure it's packaged adequately, and then ship it back to them. And so, yeah, it's quite involved, the whole process.
Cool. Very nice. One of our questions was about pension plans, which you've already talked about. Now, so let me jump on to the next one, which is when you grind nibs, do you do that only for specific regular customers, or have you done any special projects like collabs or something like that?
Yeah, I've done a few, kind of special projects or what have you. I've done batches of nibs for Goulet on Homo sapiens, Visconti Homo sapiens. So I've done a cursive smooth italic, a version of that specifically for them. I remember the first time I did a batch for them, they thought they would have, I think I did like 20 or 30, I forget exactly how many, somewhere around there. And they thought they would have them for, maybe a week or two, that they would be available on their website. And they had sent me, so I could promote it as well. They had sent me a link to the page, and they were all gone in like 12 hours or something like that. They were sold out. And it's like it's not a cheap pen. So I think Yeah, I think they were surprised and I was surprised. And the way their system worked at the time, I don't know if it still works this way. I think their system works a little differently. But at the time, the way their system worked is when it was sold out, it was like the page, you couldn't even see that page anymore. So the link they had sent me, you would get like it was like there's nothing there. It wasn't that it was gone. It was like, you couldn't even see the information. But yeah, I've done a few rounds of that. As a matter of fact, I have a batch of pins coming in from them to work on. And I do. I've done batches of nibs for other retailers from time to time. I have one retailer that they'll send me vanishing point nib units, and I'll grind those into Curse of the Talon. I have one. Then I also do stuff for custom pin makers. There's one custom pin maker, Scriptorium. It's a lady. Her name's Renee, and I check all of her nibs for quality control, tune and smooth them. So that way that lets her concentrate on making the pins themselves. So I do that. And I did a large process for a company called ASC, where they made these a set of pins called the Three Kings. And I did a kind of a needlepoint style grind, a cursive smooth italic, and an architect on each one of those pens. And so that was 50 sets. So that was 150, basically 150 grinds, different grinds. It's interesting though, because that process is a little different than doing regular customers, because I don't do the video that I do for other customers. I don't send, do the invoicing. So I can do a whole, batch those. I can just sit there and do a bunch of grinds. It's still involved. It's still, a lot of work. Like for ASC, those were large, like number 8 style nibs. So it's a lot of, those were gold nibs. So quite involved, so yeah.
Yeah, cool. So that actually gives me a good segue into my next question, which is, what is the most stressful thing about nib work? Is it the work itself, or is it what happens earlier, or what happens later? What would you think?
Yeah, the most stressful parts are, it's really, typically it's not the grinding process. Once you've done enough grinding and working on nibs, that part kind of, works itself out. The most stressful parts are customer satisfaction. When they're not sitting right in front of you to work with, you really want them to be happy with, what you've done. So that's probably one of the main things that's kind of stressful, as far as, are they going to be happy when they get it? And that varies from grind to grind. It's like I do a needlepoint style grind. Those some customers may find something like that scratchy if they're not used to it. It's a very pointed tip. So it helps if the person is familiar with that, know what they want. The other thing is shipping packages back and hoping that the customer, that product, because it's out of my hands. I give it to somebody, and hopefully it flows through the carrier, whether it be FedEx, UPS, USPS, DHL, what have you. Hopefully it gets back to them okay. So yeah.
Okay, great, Mark. And I think we have what's probably the last question for today. I know you did not play any favorites with the pens when you had this question, but you have any favorite nib manufacturers that you would like to or you like to work with?
For the most part, I don't really have any favorites per se. Some nibs I find easier to work on. The QC sometimes is better. For the most part, the Bach and the YOLO nibs are pretty good and straightforward. They make so many of them. I think that if they weren't, they probably wouldn't be in business for one thing. But typically those nibs are pretty good and clean. But there's I like for the most part all of the Japanese manufacturers, Platinum, Pilot, Sailor, typically all of their nibs are pretty pretty good, made pretty uniform, straightforward. I like the Platinum coarse nib to do like an architect on, just because of the amount of tipping that it has. Yeah, the size of it. That and the Zoom nib, the Sailor Zoom nib.
Yeah.
Without getting into specialty grinds or specialty tipping that Sailor can do themselves, where they can apply a larger amount of tipping and do something with their Naginata or their Cross Emperor or stuff like that. You're getting more involved with that. But with stock nibs, the Platinum C and the Pilot makes one as well, I think, and then the Zoom. They all have ones that have. That's the main thing, as well as I sometimes get a question or a customer wants something in particular, like Bach make a double broad nib, and Platinum, their C nib, I think, is really considered a double broad. But what's interesting is the shape of the tipping. So like a Bach double broad may be wide, so more stub-like, where the Platinum is taller, the tipping material is taller. And that's important for an architect, because the architect, it relies on the height of the tipping, to show more line variation. Some companies, their tipping is harder than others. Whatever tipping material they use itself. For the most part, they're all similar, but there are some that are noticeably a harder type material. Typically, Mont Blanc's nibs. Theirs are very beautiful, as far as the grinds. Like if you get a broad nib from Mont Blanc, what's interesting is like the facets. They grind the top. Some manufacturers grind the top of nibs. It's typically a gold nib. They'll grind the top of the nib down. Steel nibs, they leave the ball shape and just shape it like a ball. Sometimes it's good to have it that way, with it being a ball, because then there's more material to work with. But yeah, pretty much they're all pretty similar.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Mark. What I'm going to do now is we've come to the end of the questions, and I think you've answered most questions from the chat as well. I am going to invite Jaspreet and Kshitij back here to join us. It's been an interesting, very knowledgeable, very enlightening session, at least for me. May I request Jaspreet to just give a small word of thanks to Mark for spending his time and giving us all this fantastic information.
So I totally enjoyed the whole session. Your journey from being a kid, getting a pen, and then how you went on to the different shows and how you started doing it professionally. Also, seeing the whole grinding process live. It's one thing seeing it at a show, but I think this was probably even better than seeing it, the grinding process at a show, because all the camera angles and the magnifying glass and seeing it from your point of view was a different thing. And we really enjoyed the whole session. And I hope when this coronavirus thing gets over, maybe sometime you come to India and all of us hang out.
Yeah, that would
So
be
that
fun.
would be great. Yeah. And Mumbai is a pretty fun place to hang out.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'd enjoy that.
We're a bit notorious in that, Mark, because people come here for one reason and all they end up doing is hanging out with us, which is what Jasprit does all the time.
Yeah.
So we just like to have fun.
Nice.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty
So-
sure we can find some really good mango chutney for you to take back.
I've had a few customers send me a bottle of mango chutney.
Oh, that's great.
That's funny. So is there a pen show in India, or?
We have one toward the early part of the year. It's about February or March. Usually we have it. That's probably because it happens in Mumbai, and that's probably the best weather in Mumbai.
Right.
So it started in 2019. That was pretty well attended. 2020, I don't know, it could be because of the coronavirus scare, because we were at the starting point of that coronavirus scare. The response, I believe, was not as good as the previous year, but I hope it gets better.
Right. Cool.
Okay.
Right.
So thank you very much, Mark, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Shitesh. Thanks, Jasprit.
Thank you.
Just a message to all of us. Mark, really appreciate you taking the time, spending it with us, almost a couple of hours, and it was very nice to hear you. Very enlightening as well.
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, appreciate you having us, being here with us. Thank you so much,
You're welcome.
and have a
Thanks.
good evening, everyone.